I don't know of a single sign attached to a single pub anywhere, and this isn't hyperbole, I've never encountered an accurate date on a pub sign anywhere in the country. The landlord or the licensee or the brewery just pulled it out of the air.
Really?
Yeah.
James, welcome to the British History channel and podcast. Thank you for joining me today at Harvington. We're here for the Harvington History Festival. You'll be talking shortly. And you'll be talking about the myths which grow up around historic buildings, things like secret passageways and doorways, I presume, and all of these kinds of things. And we were just discussing earlier how you're actually tailoring the talk to Harvington for this one, which is, so I'm really, really looking forward to that. So is there something particular, or is there something about particular buildings, which attract folklore and myths? And what is it about them?
I think there are particular buildings, so I think you're probably correct on that one. In the case of Harvington, I think it's the Catholic connection, it's the secretive nature of it, the recusancy, the well-known and famous, rightly so, priest hides, which give it this air of mystery. And that's fantastically interesting, it's truthful, we can go and read about it, we can go and look at the archaeology of it, it's real, it's tangible. But for some people, that's not enough. They want more. There should be a secret passage out of here as well. If the priest is in the priest hide and he's in danger of being captured, well, he must have a passage to the village or the pub, or in this case, there's a story to a local quarry and he can make his escape from there. There's no evidence to back any of that up. So there are certain properties that do seem to engender this, but I'm not really picking on Harvington in this particular instance, because these stories can be found all over the country. And one of the things that I say as I tour up and down the country, and I think I've made the point in my book as well, is that every single hamlet, village, town and city in the land has at least one secret passage rumour. Wherever you go, this is ubiquitous folklore. We might imagine that we're all in danger of falling through if the vaults of these secret passages give way. Yeah, there's no archaeological evidence. It says something about our obsessions. It says something, I think, partly about there is an obsession with the idea of Catholics needing a covert means of either access into a building or escape from a building. I think those stories grow up in the aftermath of the Reformation, and particularly during this period where Harvington has its famous priest hides, that there is this idea of hiding, of secretiveness. Those Catholics are up to no good. And I think that's where we get these stories from. But it's part of our deeper cultural makeup as well. So these underground subterraneous stories are in our oldest folk tales, really, that are recorded in the medieval period. Things like the Green Children of Woolpit or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. They include underground spaces. And then there's a direct through line from those to the neo-Gothic romantic novels, which often have underground spaces and in particular secret passages, and all the way through to the modern novel with Enid Blyton having so many in the famous five novels. And I just think all of this gets brought together, and often the way that the story is told is by a relative that you trust or a supposed figure of authority, and it becomes this potent mix of believability, but it's often believed on an emotional level rather than a logical level. And that's why these stories become so popular. So yes, there are certain buildings or places which are said to be riddled with secret passages, but most areas, most settlements have got at least one story anyway. So it's all over.
Is it a particularly English or British thing?
I've only in my research tended to look at the British context of it, and it really is the length and breadth of the country. But there are certainly beliefs in secret passages across the world. So, for example, a very recent urban legend, urban myth, if you like, is that there was the tunnel between the pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. and the White House. And this was a big kind of QAnon-esque conspiracy theory that, you know, the Obamas and the Clintons had this tunnel going to a pizza restaurant of all places. So the stories are found all across the world, and also in a very modern context as well. You know, we've not got Catholics using them in the 16th century there. We've got, you know, a shady presidential cabal using them. So we do find them across the world.
That's quite funny that they decided to go to a pizza place though. So, okay, secret passageways are a common theme.
Yeah.
Do we have any other common themes?
Yeah, the book which I wrote, which we call Historic Building Mythbusting, was really devoted to looking at these tropes which just appear, you know, and are widely believed, widely repeated, and essentially widely loved. So the sort of canon of folklore about historic buildings might include the story that all castle staircases turn to the right, clockwise, to advantage right-handed defenders fighting downhill, whose right sword arm will not be impeded by the central newel post, and they have the advantage over somebody fighting uphill. That's really popular. It's repeated all over the internet, magazines, newspapers, TV documentaries, films. It's almost impossible to move for that one, but it was invented in 1902 by an art critic obsessed with spirals, left-handedness and fencing, and he kind of cooked it up from his own interesting biography, a guy called Theodore Cook. But you can see it's only just over 100 years old, but it's become part of the not just national but international consensus about what castles are for, that they are fortifications, so even the staircases must be defensible. But you can see the potency of that, because I think it's sort of a bias about what we think castles are actually for, that they are defensive military fortifications. Ultimately, I don't believe that that's their primary purpose. I think they're all about showing off, kind of medieval willy waving, really, if you like. Status displays by great lords, that's their primary function. And there is a bit of security, but you know, there's no evidence to suggest that these things were defensive. But you know, there's other iterations of it as well. So other iterations of stories. So the idea that lots of timber frame buildings are made of ship timbers that have been reclaimed, often from famous warships. And sometimes they try and make the connection with Trafalgar and the Victory, or with ships that were involved in the Spanish Armada. This idea of kind of national consciousness, this sort of pride in naval defeats of enemies without that kind of thing, and this idea of a maritime nation, you know, embattled, the underdog. It speaks of those stories as well. And again, they're widely told. I can think of dozens of examples inland. I mean, we're very far inland here in Worcestershire, where we have that story, and these ship timbers are supposed to have been brought 60, 70 miles inland. It's very, very unlikely, but it's widely believed because of the emotional context of the story. Yeah. So it's not just secret passages, there are tropes which you can see running through the folklore of ancient buildings.
Now, there's one particular one that I think you visit quite often, and that is the claim of the oldest pub.
Yeah.
There seems to be oldest pubs. Now, are they just picking, you know, oldest pub and some kind of nuance to make it the oldest pub? Or is it just a good marketing technique? Mostly
the landlord or the licensee or the brewery just pulled it out of the air.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know of a single sign attached to a single pub anywhere, and this isn't hyperbole, I just have never encountered an accurate date on a pub sign anywhere in the country. So if you see 13th century inn or built in 1216 or something like that, it's not true. I don't know of a single accurate example anywhere. And yeah, I do think a lot of it starts as marketing, but because people kind of assume that if it's written down, if it's published in a sense, well, somebody must have looked at it. It must be based on truth. Quite often it's not. And when you start looking into where these claims come from, very quickly it turns out that they're quite recent. So I know of pubs which have not been claimed to be the oldest until really the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, really, really recent. And there's one pub which shall remain nameless in this particular iteration, which only started claiming to be the oldest pub in England in 1970, but it had only opened the year before. Now, it is an old building, late 15th century building,
right?
But it had not been a pub until 1969. And then they start claiming it's the oldest pub in the country. So this is marketing, and people get fiercely loyal about it. So local people want their local pub to be the oldest. And this is why we kind of have a spread of them. There's about 24 or so which claim to be the oldest. And there's a broad geographical, regional assemblage of them. So each area or each county has its contender. You know, where I live in Nottingham, it's the Old Ship to Jerusalem, which claims to have opened in 1189 and to be the oldest inn in England. The irony being it's not even the oldest pub in Nottingham. And that's the East Midlands contender. If you go to the home counties, there's a couple down there, the Fighting Cocks in St Albans, the Royal Stand of England in 40 Green. And again, you can go to the Cridford Inn in Devon, and wherever you go. Lancashire and Yorkshire have got skin in the game with the Old Man and Scythe in Lancashire, and the Bingley Arms in West Yorkshire. So everybody's got skin in the game because everybody wants their local to be the oldest. And it's like support for your local football team. You don't want to be the loser of the league, you want to be the winner.
It's a shame that not only may they not be the oldest, but they may not even be that old.
No, most of them aren't. Of the claimants, there's only a couple of them that genuinely are medieval buildings. Most of the claimants are post-medieval. But I think the way that, if you put your cynical hat on for a moment, I think the way that it works is that most people don't know the difference between a 17th century building and a 12th century building because they've got other priorities. It's not their priority to understand the nuance of buildings archaeology. It's only a few nerds like myself that really get that stuff. And why would people understand this stuff at all? It's not something that a huge amount of people are that interested in, but they will believe it because they will believe that somebody must have researched it. It's an interesting context, but unfortunately that folklore is often very modern and has often been dreamed up for marketing purposes. But there are genuine pubs out there that are ancient. There's about 12 to 14 medieval inns which were built as inns, have always been inns and are still doing service to this day. And the earliest of those is late 14th century. And then there's a number of them that they become slightly more numerous in the 15th century. So in that kind of 125-year period, you've got about 12 or 14 inns which do survive, but there's nothing earlier than that, despite all of the claims. There's one in Cambridgeshire which claims to date to 560 AD. Which I think is hilarious.
Yeah, that's pushing it.
Well, that's a period of time where we don't even know if King Arthur was real, let alone if they were pulling pints of a Saturday night. So, you know, the building itself is probably late medieval, but it's sort of maybe 1,000 years later it was built. There's no evidence that there was a previous pub on the site, and it's actually a conversion of a house or a farm. Yeah.
So, in your research, what do you think myths and lore tell us about ordinary people's lives?
One of the things I've been interested by as I've researched the book and then the blog that sort of accompanies it and the lectures is that the folklore is important. And if you learn to read between the lines of the folklore, you do learn something about the communities that repeat this. And the way that the book actually started was a kind of wry exasperation about the repetition of these stories and, you know, the firm belief in them and the fact that they're not based on actual archaeology or historical research. And trying to not undermine them, but to try and debunk, essentially, to contextualize them. And when I first started it, I suppose I was a little bit more pejorative about this stuff. So it started off with me saying, well, look, here's the story, here's the debunking. And it kind of ended there. That's how the blog started. But as I really got into the writing of the book, and then as the blog developed, I realised that actually the real interest is, where does the story come from? Why do we tell these stories? What does it add to our understanding of society, really? And the fact that these are so widely believable, if you don't know a great deal about historic buildings, and easily repeated, gives them legs, essentially. But a lot of the stories do come down to a kind of a national pride, if you like. You know, there's the local pride with the pubs, but the national pride, you can kind of see that in the way that they are communicating a kind of an us and them narrative, if you like. So the secret passages, so many of those have Catholic buildings, to return back to what we were talking about previously. And I do think that this is innate to the kind of suspicion of the enemy within during the Reformation, this idea that you can't trust the Catholics, they're up to something, they're secretive, they're covert. So there's a suspicion of an enemy there. And then that becomes, I think, more overt with things like ship timbers, where it's famous warships that have either been captured and broken down, or this is a timber from the ship that fought against the French or against the Spanish. And again, it speaks of the later period. It doesn't tell us anything about the medieval period and the lived realities of that period. What these stories do is tell us about the times when the stories grew up. So mostly the post-medieval period. And quite a lot of these stories do have 18th, 19th century origins. And so you're learning more about that period. And that tells you about these national or even local preoccupations. And all these stories, such as the ship timbers and the secret passage story, do tend to speak of national identity and this idea of pride in victory, in the defeat of an enemy, whether it be Catholic priests at a place like Harvington, or whether it be Catholic nations such as France and Spain. So I think it says something about that, but also given the context of the time when these stories really do start to become very popular, it's at the height, in the 19th century, it's at the height of the British Empire as well, and this kind of us and them narrative and the pride in the development of empire. So there can be some quite interesting stories to emerge from there. It's not necessarily just, oh, that landlord was trying to pull a fast one to get some more custom in. You know, there's other stuff that if you read between the subtext of the stories, there is a tale to be told, and that's the enjoyment that I got. It's there with the spiral staircase myth to an extent as well. This idea of the martial nation, the idea that castles are military fortifications, this idea of sort of power and might, but you know, the implied violence of that as well, the idea of sword fighting. Even the staircases must be dedicated to this. And I do think that there's a kind of a loss of understanding that the past was more complex, that it was nuanced. Yes, castles could be besieged and defended, etc., but it wasn't their primary purpose. And for the first 100 years of castle studies, the defensive aspect of them was massively overstated. And it was overstated because it was mainly, with one or two exceptions, and I mean one or two exceptions, to the first 100 years of castle studies, it was a boys' club. It was a manly discussion, and a lot of these men had military backgrounds or had grown up during intense periods of warfare, such as the First or Second World War, and so they tell their story grafted onto the past.
Right.
So there's all sorts of folklore. Some is modern, some is ancient, but it's getting under the skin of it and understanding the context of when the stories were told and why, and what that tells us.
Fascinating. James, where can people find your tell us about your book, and also where can they find you online? Okay,
well, the book has been published by the History Press, and it's available from all good and bad retailers. The usual places to find books online and both physical copies as well. I run a small heritage consultancy called Triskelly Heritage. We mainly deal with surveys of historic buildings, but I also do a lot of lecturing work, bits of media stuff as well, TV, radio, podcasts, and of course the writing as well. So I've been running Triskelly Heritage for nearly a decade now, and obviously, like everywhere else, we have a website, and that's actually where the blog is. Wonderful. From where the book started. But yeah, the book is available via the History Press though.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, James.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been good fun.